All right, Mr. Ambassador, we're about ready to start. Major Oliver, he's going to do a little bit of opening comments, and then I'll do a brief introduction of you, sir, and then we'll kick it from there.
All right, I don't see you on video as yet.
Yes, sir. I know, sir. I know. I have a beautiful face too. But, I'm waiting on that to come, and once I connect it, sir, we'll be able to see everybody. Yes, sir. But they can see you. All the students can see you, sir.
Mm.
All right.
Switch camera.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Ambassador.
Yes, sir.
Sir, how you doing? Major Oliver here.
Well, where's here? I don't see you, of course.
We trying to work on, hey, it's Swan's fault. We gonna blame it on Swan. We don't have the camera on right now. So, but we can't see you, sir. The students can't see you.
Well, I thought you fellas working one of these secret installations where you can't show where you are.
You know, we like to show you a little bit every now and then. We like to show you a little bit every now and then.
All right.
So, sir, first of all, thank you for taking your time for us today. You passing this knowledge on to our entry-level Marines and keeping our history and traditions going is important to us. So we are truly thankful and grateful for your time that you're about to bestow upon these Marines. So as we get out of this COVID time, we want to get you here in person. I know that was our initial thought, to get you here in person, so we're going to continue to work on that. Again, these are entry-level Marines. They want to soak up as much knowledge as you can pass on to them. So on behalf of Lieutenant Colonel Sicano and Sergeant Major Maury, the detachment leadership here, we thank you for your time, and we appreciate it. And we look forward to what you can offer us.
Well, I just want to know it's a pleasure to be with you folks, and whatever I can share with you, I'm happy to do so.
Okay, great, sir. Thank you very much. Hey, again, we're gonna get you out here in person.
Well, I'd love
with
that.
that being said, Swan, you could, I'm gonna turn it over to Mr. Swan while he worked through these camera issues, and he could go ahead with his introductions.
All righty.
All right, so good afternoon, Marines.
Yeah.
So I briefed you earlier, or talked to you earlier about who this was, the gentleman here. I would like to refer to him as a Marines Marine. My first conversation I had with him on the phone, we didn't know each other. Automatically, he was telling me, hey, go get these books. Read this book. Oh, read this book about this. So he was automatically, as a Marine, passing knowledge on. To me, that's a Marines Marine, that you don't know him from a hole in the wall. And at the end of the day, as long as he knows that you're a Marine, you're a devil dog, he's going to pass that knowledge on. He's going to give you something to carry on, to put in your backpack to help you be successful. So we're going to listen to him today talk about his experiences in the Marine Corps, what he got out of the Marine Corps, how the Marine Corps, how he had to adjust. It's just as well as where you all are right now. You're in that adjustment stage in the Marine Corps. You're in that stage where I'm still trying to figure out what's going on in the Marine Corps, how the Marine Corps really operates, and how the Marine Corps can make me successful as a career, or if I choose to get out of the Marine Corps. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Ambassador Britton. Sir, the floor is yours.
All righty. I wish I could see you folks, because after all, I want to be talking to you and with you. And I want you to raise questions when you have one, because if I tell everything that I know, I don't learn a thing from you. But when you talk, I learn something from you. So I want to start off by saying that life has been good to me. I started off, as I say, in the South. As you may know, I started off in the South and came to New York when I was about 10. And from there, it was a complete change of everything. And I was reminded of something when I went into college. I was majoring in banking and finance. And in the course of it, the professor started off talking And he mentioned something that appeared in the book whereby someone said it was like piling Palion on Ossus. And someone asked, sir, what does that mean? And the professor said, I don't know, I haven't looked it up. And so I raised my hand and proceeded to tell them that Palion was a mountain in Greece and Ossus was a mountain in Greece. And so the enemy, according to mythology, in order to make it up to Mount Olympus, piled Palion, the smaller mountain, on top of Ossus, the bigger mountain, and they got there. And everybody stood there astounded, including the professor. Well, at that point, I had established myself as an authority on some sorts. But the professor began talking right afterwards about money. Money and banking was the subject. And he pulled out a roll of bills and he told of how this was just paper. Just paper. It didn't mean a thing and it wasn't worth a thing. We used it as a storehouse of value and a measure of value and so forth. But basically, it was nothing. It was nothing. We sat there, we were stunned. We were freshmen. We were stunned at this new knowledge, all except one guy. And he said, if you suckers believe that, pass your wallets to the left. And everything broke up at that point. The professor asked, who was that? Who was that? But no one would talk. But anyway, off I went. Now, what I'm saying, what I'm beginning to, I want to insert or make known is that there are opportunities for you to become experts in subjects, and suddenly you can be the one to do the talking. In the Marine Corps, unfortunately, sometimes you're stopped. In the book Echoes of Our War by 10 fellows who served over in Vietnam, it seemed that there was a first lieutenant who was in charge of an amphibian truck battalion, and he knew what the terrain was over in Vietnam. And the officers were making decisions which he knew was only going to get the trucks bogged down. So he spoke up, and one said, shut up. Lieutenants don't talk in these meetings. Well, they ended up getting stuck and a lot of people got killed. But what I'm saying is in the Marine Corps, sometimes, even though you may be the expert, you may not always be the one welcome to do the talking, but you have to do it in advance. Let people know how you stand, who you are, what you know, and so forth. I had a question in which the dear sergeant had posed to me that I was to mention certain subjects, what was my experience in the Marine Corps, what was my entry level thoughts and so forth. I'm trying to find it here, but the point is, I came directly in the Marine Corps from high school. And I was in high school in New York at the time. I had come to New York at the age of 10 years old, and I had gone to schools, segregated schools, obviously, or should I say all black schools in the South. And when I came to New York, my family registered me in Harlem, in the black section of New York. They didn't think very much of me, so they put me back from 7th grade to 4th grade. And about 2 months later, my father lost his job, and I ended up down south, down in mid-Manhattan in the white section, and they had an entirely different opinion of me. So that's what I ended up. Ended up going back up in my grades. Okay. I wanted to say that what the Marine taught me, and get on to some other subjects. It was that I was born in the South, where good manners was something you learned quite early. For an African American, it also meant deference, subservience, and segregation, like bowing politely, speaking softly, and knowing your place. These were the days of white supremacy and maybe black subjugation. But in 1936, the family moved north to New York. By January 1944, thanks to the Marine Corps, I was back in the South. Some would say Montford Point, an appendage of Camp Lejeune, was segregated, but how could it be? Our officers were white, but they were still part of us. When I arrived, my drill instructors were all Black, but after 8 years in the New York City system, studying under mostly white teachers who loved me, I had learned to receive education from anyone who had something to teach. Each Marine, officer or enlisted, had knowledge I could use. And as I looked at the MOSs that you guys hold, I see so many opportunities to ask you 1,000 questions. Even, I remember, I think I saw one was a food service specialist. And I know so much about food. When I was in elementary school, the boys went to woodwork and the girls went to cooking. So my teacher in woodwork came over to me and said, Britton, I've got entirely too many boys for this class. Would you mind taking the class in cooking? And I said, me? And he said, yes. He said, you'll never regret it. Well, not only did I learn a lot about cooking, but I got fat just eating this cooking that was done by the girls. Secondly, I learned something that today supports me. Whenever I'm alone or something, my wife lives down in Amelia Island at times, and I'm up here in Atlanta by myself. Who does the cooking? I do. Now, I don't know if you guys know it, but I'm 95 years old. So often people ask me, well, who cooks for you? And I said, I cook. And they said, well, who does your driving? And I said, I do the driving. But the cooking comes because much of it started when I was about 12 years old in New York in a cooking class. So I'll go on though, but suffice to say that in those days, I really learned an awful lot. My teachers were very, very kind. Why, I have no idea, but they just took a liking to me. And even one teacher would say to me, Britton, when you get some money, buy yourself some AT&T stock. That was when AT&T stock cost a few dollars. Now it costs a few hundred, $1,000. But in addition, another one took me on as a pet, and I always seemed to get all the best things that she had to offer in her class. Anyway, for anyone above me, meaning finished, I had finished, by the time I finished boot camp, I was taught to stand erect, look straight, heads up, shoulders back, chin in, chest out, and to speak up. This teaching, unlike the other South, was to anyone, white or Black, officer or enlisted. In addition, I was not only issued an M1 rifle, but taught to take it apart, put it back together again, and to shoot it, to fire it. And by those days, the M1 rifle weighed about, maybe about 10 pounds or so. And it was something that you had to be able to take it apart and put it together, blindfolded, no less. They also gave me a long bayonet, made me sharpen it, and taught me to use it, like plunging it into a man's stomach or whacking his head off. Lastly, my judo instructor taught me to subdue and even to kill an enemy with my bare hands. For better or for worse, I can say that I never spilled the blood of anyone's son, husband, brother, or father while in World War II or in Korea. And I can say that I've done about 170 something countries by now, and I've learned to make friends all over the world and so forth. I think part of it comes from the fact that I'm always trying to help people improve themselves, just as I would like to do the same thing for you. I wish I could see you guys. I wish I was up there. I would have been able to help my friends up there to get better with their video. Sometimes when people tell me, if you have a problem, you ought to call your grandson and have him to show you. And I said, no. My grandsons call me to show them. Anyway, a New York teacher, Dr. L. Walter Stevens, spent 4 years almost teaching me to be a gentleman and a scholar. He never told me what the job would pay or where I'd go to apply for it, but he just talked about being a gentleman and a scholar. After a few months of physical training, the Corps sent me to the Pacific, where I was exposed to books of the United States Armed Forces Institute. And my interests are eclectic. I'm interested in knowledge. But let me get back to Dr. L. Walter Stevens. He would constantly remind me, Britton, I want you to be a gentleman and a scholar. And I don't know why he chose me, but the fact is he kept pounding it into my head. I remember one day I was fighting with a boy over a comic book. And Mr. Stevens came over and he said, Britton, you'll never be a gentleman and a scholar if you're going to spend your life fighting over a comic book. I let go of that boy, and it was something like 30-something years before I even touched a comic book after that. But one day, not too long ago, my younger daughter was reading a paper where it said, it talked about this man who was one of the forgotten people of Long Island, a great teacher. And it talked about Mr. L. Walter Stevens. She got on the phone immediately, called the person who had written the story and said, oh no, he's not forgotten. My father talks about him all the time. And my father is a U.S. ambassador. So I want you to know that Mr. Stevens, who was my official teacher, always put something into my head that came to me later on. I've mentioned that my interests are sort of eclectic, which means I am interested in most subjects. And I have to tell you folks, no matter what your subject is, try while you're still young. And I mean between 20 and 30, to learn everything you can. Like exercise, we build up our muscles by exercising. Well, with reading, studying, and asking questions, you build up your brain, because after 30, it begins to retract. And by the time you reach 40 or 50, it's coming down. It's really retracting. So you need to get as much of it in your brain as you can. Okay. Although I was able to get a hold of many books, I had another unique experience. I roomed with 4 medical corpsmen. These were college educated, they were older, and they became my resources. They began to teach me so many different things. When one of them mentioned something like acetylsalicylic acid, he had me. That's aspirin, for those who don't know. But they began to teach me so many different words, but so did my officers. And whenever I asked a question, the officers always seemed to respond. They were happy to teach me. And by the same token, sometimes if they didn't know a subject that I was asking about, I looked it up and I was able to teach them. My officers, some of whom were Southerners, encouraged me in my readings and readily supplied answers to my never-ending questions. Around me, the strange island of Guadalcanal drew my attention, educating me on this new environment. I had also stopped off in what's called Espiritu Santo, New Hebrides. And I remember the day my boat stopped there. We went out on what's called the U.S. Army Transport Sea Perch out of Norfolk, Virginia on July 7th. And it took us 33 days to get to Guadalcanal. But on about the 27th day, we stopped at New Hebrides, and many of us were standing at the railing looking as the boat pulled up and began to be moored, when suddenly a young man in a Jeep drove along, young sailor in a Jeep drove along and stopped. And the fellows asked him what was doing. Was he stationed there on the island? And he said, yes. And they asked, well, what are the guys doing up there? And he said, well, right now they're having lunch. It's shower time. And boy, with that, 700 guys came jumping off that ship as fast as they could to get up there and have lunch with the people. I don't think they ever knew where we came from, but they certainly found enough food to feed us at that time. Anyway, speaking of Guadalcanal, I began to learn an awful lot about the place, the terrain, the people, and so forth, and the history and political geography of it. Years later, in fact, in 2008, I was up in Korea, and I saw three men walking down in the hotel, and they were coming towards me. So I stopped them. They were brown skinned, blonde hair, and pretty much looked like me, other than they weren't quite looking like me. Anyway, I stopped and I said, "Are you gentlemen Melanesian?" And they said, "Yes." I said, "Are you from the Solomon Islands?" And they said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, I was on Guadalcanal in Tenerife." And one man said, "I'm the mayor of Tenerife." And with that, I asked him about another fellow who was a young boy when I was there. He was about 18 or 19, like myself. And they said he became one of our most distinguished statesmen. He died last year. And anyway, I established a friendship with those three men. And for the rest of the time I was in this conference, they were my constant companions. But that's one of the things that I learned about Guadalcanal. Okay, after 8 months, I was transferred to Maui in the Hawaiian Islands, where my cup of knowledge continued to run over. Maui was always special. It did something special for me. When I left New York was still pretty much of a restrictive place. In other words, for many of the top flight restaurants, although I had money, was well dressed or something, I simply was not accepted in it. But it was on November 10th, 1945, I decided that I would have lunch downtown, dinner downtown, although it's a big day in the Marine Corps for eating, as you well know. I went downtown to the Maui Grand Hotel and ordered Muscovy duck and wine. This is getting close. It was just past my 19th birthday, and it was a waiter in livery. He had a tuxedo on and what have you. In addition, the table was set with linen, crystal, silver, and so forth. And I had Muscovy duck and felt like a real king. It was like crossing the Rubicon. Once you dine like that, you never go back. I've had some wonderful dinners since that time, and many of them, but none ever topped this. In addition, as I think back to it, November 10th was the first day the Marine Corps commissioned a Black Marine officer. Frederick Branch became our first second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. But at the same time that he was given his commission, he was also given his discharge. Why? Because the Marine Corps had a regulation at that point called, I think, Regulation 421, which specifically stated that no colored Marine could ever be superior to a white Marine. So that in the event one had, say, 4 stripes and was assigned to an organization in which another white Marine had 1 stripe, the white Marine would be in charge. So this was why Frederick Branch was discharged that day to the reserves. He remained in the reserves, but came back on active duty at a certain point and came out of the reserves as a captain. So much for Fred Branch. But everything I learned day in and day out seemed to be built on what the Marine Corps taught me. That's why I have such high regard for you folks in the Marine Corps today. When I look at the number of different kinds of work, different kinds of schools you're being taught, I'm always amazed at how the Marine Corps has grown. I will have to say, by the way, that some of my best friends in the Corps have been men who have held 3 stars, black men, by the way. I'm talking about people like Lieutenant General Gaskin, Lieutenant General Williams, Frank Peterson, and others who really gone up there. And it's a measure of how the Marine Corps has changed. Let me say this: in 1948, the Marine Corps, I decided to re-enlist in the Marine Corps in the reserves in 1948 because March 48, because I felt the day would come when I'd be going into government, and this meant that I would accrue time in the Marine Corps, in government for pension purposes, for which I live off today in today's world. As it was, we were not, African Americans were not allowed to join any of the active groups. So one day the Marine Corps assembled a group of us non-commissioned officers and talked with us about establishing an all African American trucking company in Harlem. And I immediately said, wait a minute, we want to join the rifle companies, the tank companies, the signal companies, and some of the other companies that are already active. And they said, no, we're not going to allow you to do those. You have to join what we put up for you. So I objected because just at that point, President Truman had been talking about integrating the armed forces. And by the same token, I don't know if any of you have heard about Montford Point in North Carolina, but it was a separate training boot camp set up for African American Marines in World War II. In 1948, it was continuing. And so I began to raise questions since the president was advocating desegregating the armed forces, why were they then going against him by setting up a separate organization to continue it? The Marine Corps said that it would continue doing exactly that. And so I objected. I got in touch with my congressman. I was a scoutmaster at the congressman's church up there in the area, and brought it to his attention. Now I have to tell you, when I was born in 1925, there was not one African American in the House of Representatives or the Senate, or even in the government for that matter, in any position of responsibility. So this Congressman, Adam Clayton Powell, got in touch with the Secretary of Defense, and back came a letter from the Deputy Commandant of the Marine Corps, Major General Oliver P. Smith, which said, henceforth, all organizations will be open without regard to race, creed, or color. This was in 1948. Very little was done, if anything. At that time, of course, luckily in the summer of 1948, the Marine Corps commissioned its first regular Marine Corps officer of color. That was John Earl Rudder out at Purdue University in Indiana. He went on duty, unfortunately, because of the pressures against him and some of the continuing prejudice. He elected to leave the Marine Corps after a year or two. But that was a significant year. Okay. It was 2 years later, in 1950, the war broke out, and it really attracted my attention that the United States was on the side of the United Nations. What had happened is, going back to 1944 in Guadalcanal, I began to read about something called the Anglo-American Caribbean Commission. And it turns out that a young African American by the name of Ralph Bunch was the executive secretary to it. I became interested in that line of activity and decided that one day I would love to go into the diplomatic and consular service. Okay. I followed the formation of the United Nations a year later in San Francisco. I even got to meet Harold Stassen, the former governor of Minnesota, who was the youngest signer of the United Nations Charter. And I went to visit the United Nations when they were still meeting in tents out in Long Island while I was living in New York after coming out of the Marine Corps. Okay. When the United Nations decided to oppose the rush of the communist forces coming down from North Korea, I favored it. And so when I was called back to active duty, I readily agreed. And on 2nd of September, 1950, I reported for duty at Brooklyn Navy Yard and ended up going down to Camp Lejeune. I also decided to apply for a commission since, based on all of the criteria, I qualified. I was a non-commissioned officer, had completed 3 years of college. I was at NYU at the time, and took some other exams and passed them with flying colors. Okay, I got right down to the meeting with the group of officers. I think it's called the oral interview. And when I came in, everything seemed very cordial and affable. But right in the middle of the discussion, one of the lieutenants, he was the only lieutenant there, remembered that I had opposed the Marine Corps in 1948. And with that, all of the officers began to start walking out, except for one officer, one of the Marine Corps women officers at the time. She was a captain. And I got word later on that my application had been denied. Okay, but then I realized that my enlistment was up. And so I applied for a discharge. And 2 months later, I was back at NYU finishing my degree. Okay, I was disappointed, but in ways, the Lord moves in mysterious ways, they say. It's been a gratifying thing. I kind of gravitated away from the Marine Corps, although later on I ended up going into government. And this began to take me around to different places, representing the US government in the housing area, including traveling overseas. I had already begun traveling overseas, but in the course of it, going to the embassies, I began to meet ambassadors. I was called upon to speak in many places, as well as to meet some of the Marine Corps security guards. All of this was very inviting to me, and it brought out my interest in diplomacy. Since I had read so much, many of the ambassadors I knew a great deal about. And when I came to their places and talked with them, they were very much flattered about what I knew about them, about diplomacy and so forth, so that by 1972, people in diplomacy were interested in me. By 1974, 30 years after my first interest, I was being called upon to become a candidate for ambassador. And that's how it ended up. Now, I will say this, when I went back in 1950, I was very close to the officers for some reason. Okay, one was Warrant Officer Felber, who was in charge of the group then were promoting or being responsible for seeing that families were being taken care of as their husbands and so forth were being called back to active duty overnight practically. And I began to help him to get these things taken care of. I always remember that Warrant Officer Felber, when I was called upon to submit a letter from my commanding officer, described me as a person of probity. And I had never heard that word before. I was very much fascinated by it in a good way. Later, long afterwards, I decided to look up the name of Warrant Officer Felber to find out what was his background, his education. He had never finished high school, but during the time he was growing up, he decided to spend his time at the library, and he read every book in his local library. That's how he got his education. Okay, I want to say this for you folks. Again, I mentioned it about increasing your knowledge, increasing your brain power while you still have control of it. He did not have he did not have a college degree, and yet he was one of the most learned men I'd ever run into. You may have your degree or you may not, but it's important that you do use your Marine Corps experience and benefits to get as much college education as you can, hopefully a degree. And always keep your minds open so that you can learn as much as possible. Last week, I was talking with a friend, and he said, let me give you a word. If you may have heard about it and you may not. The word was Pilo erectus. Pilo erectus. Well, I should have known because I'm familiar with the fact that pilo, P-I-L-O, means skin, and erectus, obviously, the word erection certainly comes in. But what I didn't realize is pilo erectus actually means goosebumps, because the follicle in your skin, when irritated by something or excited by something, or even coldness, can cause your goosebumps to arise. That's known as pilo erectus. So many other things that we can learn today. And I say to a lot of the young folks, when you're going into a business, try to learn as much as you can about the business so that when the top people decided to stop and to go into a side room and talk about the business, if you know a great deal about it, how it was founded, what is its status, what is its principal products, what is its profit margins and so forth, you're going to be involved or invited to come into the room and sit with them. If you don't, they're going to pass you up. But it doesn't hurt you to learn everything that you can about anything that you can. You will always find yourself welcomed about it. I have sat in conversations with people like presidents, Nixon, Ford, Bush, and all kind of others. And I've also sat with governors. I've sat with governors general. I've sat with rulers and so forth. But because I have a certain knowledge of most subjects, it meant that for some reason I'm welcomed into the discussion. Sometimes it's because of rank. I mean, when you're a deputy assistant secretary or something, and you're ambassador or you're president of this or that, there's an assumption that you do have a great deal of knowledge. In most cases, I have not disappointed them. So I say to you, please learn all you can about every subject. When I think of the question of food service, for example, I was reading yesterday about the pandemic of 1918 and comparing it with today's pandemic, the COVID-19 and whatever. In those days, we lost more people than we did in both world wars under the pandemic of 1918. And as it happened, the government had passed a rule, since we were at war, to censor everything. You were not allowed to criticize the government or to even suggest anything that undermined the efficiency and so forth of the government. So although at one time men were literally dropping in their tracks in our army camps and Navy camps and so forth, the media was not allowed to talk about it. We almost had that same thing this past year when the president dominated the discussions so that persons who were authoritative could not speak up about it forcefully. But anyway, we lost more people in the world than we've ever lost before. But I get back to it that I also read about the plague of the 1600s and so forth. That came about because we did not have any means of preserving food until we began to get spices from India, which is why before that, Columbus started on his voyage around towards the New World in order to reach India and get spices. Our cities were growing, but we had no refrigeration. And suddenly, when we began to get spices, we were able to take care of some other problems of preserving food in larger cities. In addition, we began to do other things that made advances in medicine. Until about the late 1800s, there was very little feelings about antiseptics and so forth. We just couldn't see germs. We didn't foresee germs. When I went to Guadalcanal, each day we were given one Ativan tablet, which is sort of a derivative of iodine, and some water. That was our malaria control thing. In addition, we didn't have penicillin. We didn't have any of the other antiseptics to kill germs. So we've come a long way, but we've come a long way because people have been thinking and so forth. I read just yesterday about the latest advances in the Large Hadron Collider, which is in Switzerland. It's a 35-mile tunnel in which we're doing experiments by having two colliders to crash into each other, going at the speed of sound to see what we found as very small particles are broken up. We did successfully do one recently, but what happened is so strange to us that we don't even have words to describe it. And it turns out, of course, that even with the knowledge that we have of the universe based on these experiments, 95% of what the universe is composed of is totally unknown to us. All kinds of things that can really fascinate you if you really open your mind and give your mind to. People tell me these days, I can't understand how you remember this or remember that, but it's no secret to it. Once you train your mind to do it, just as you've trained your body to run or to do other things in physical things and athletics, you can train your mind to do it. So become an expert, make sure that you use your mind, grow your mind, and so forth. I mentioned the fact that when I was back at Camp Lejeune in 1950, by this time, everything was pretty much mixed. There were very few African-American officers, but it was growing, and it wasn't too long before in the 1970s, we had our first general. But I remember dealing with Brigadier General A.T. Selden, who was the Deputy Commanding General of Camp Lejeune. As it happens, when my wife came down to visit me, we were assigned to the staff NCO quarters in cots. And I found that fellows who had signed up or requested room after me went over to the hostess house. They were white, of course. So I asked for an audience with General Selden. Actually, I was asked for the commanding general of the camp, but he was in Washington. So General Selden quickly invited me over. When I told him what was happening over there, that African-American wives were sent to the staff NCO quarters while white wives were sent to the hostess house, he quickly said, from now on, it's going to be first come, first serve. And he said, Corporal, you keep abreast of it, and if you see anything differently, you let me know. Those persons are going to be terminated, as far as I'm concerned, immediately. Well, throughout the time that I was in the Marine Corps, I was always treated very fine. Whenever I hear people talk about how you were segregated, you were mistreated, you were this, you were that, whatever. Well, in boot camp, all Marines are treated like dogs. I want you to know about that right away, if you haven't already experienced it. But in terms of punishment and all that business, I always seem to have been treated very specially. I was never punished or anything like that, or treated royally, treated badly, or even just spoken of harshly. But I attribute that to what Mr. Stevens put into me. He continued to pound into me to be a gentleman and a scholar. And for whatever it meant that it gave me a special persona that others respected. Now, I don't know how you go about it, but always, if you can, consider yourself as someone of very great importance. Carry yourself like it, act like it, speak like it, dress like it, and others will be not intimidated, but they will notice it and treat you accordingly. So I'm going to stop at this point because there may be some questions, there should be some questions. And at the same time, I'd like to pause and give a quick breather. So go ahead, Sarge, please have a major, please have whatever questions may be on the lips of some of the people. All right?
Sir.
And I wish I could see you, by the way.
You can't see me. I put the camera up.
Yes, what you might want to do is invite me to come up there during the summer once we've gotten over this pandemic and just spend a day talking with some of the guys and gals. I'd love to do that because there's a lot of interpersonal contact that's much better sometimes than a mass lecture.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
That is, if I'm still alive. I mean, after all, I'll be approaching 96 then. So thank you. I'm ready. Ah, wonderful, wonderful. There you are. There you are. Mm-hmm.
See, I ain't even computer savvy, sir. One of the Marines had to come show me.
Wonderful, 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 wonderful.
All right, go ahead. You got a
Now,
question, sir?
are you the major or are you the sergeant?
No, I'm the gunnery sergeant. The major stepped out for a minute, sir.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
But you do have a question by one of the Marines. Go ahead.
Wonderful, wonderful. Give me your name. Give me your name first and tell me what your special.
I'm Private Becerra Rodriguez, and one of my questions was, you said you had gone to the Korean War, but you said you didn't have any bloodshed on your hands. Mm-hmm. Can you go more in detail with that?
Details about my service in Korea, in Korean War?
Yes, please.
Oh, well, actually, I was recalled on the 2nd of September, 1950. And I went back to Camp Lejeune, Hadnot Point, they called it then. But I got involved with helping fill out many of the allotment forms and whatever. I found, of course, I was married myself at the time, but I had no children or anything. But I found that there were men who were coming back with large families and so forth who were loyal to the Marine Corps, but suddenly they were taken from their jobs. The Marine Corps didn't have any particular concern with their well-being, seemingly. So I had to take on that responsibility along with Warrant Officer Felber. And so I would work Saturdays and Sundays because I was determined to take care of as many of the guys as I could. And because at that time, the warrant officer would ask me, when are you going to take some leave? And I would say, well, I can't take leave while these men are in need and so forth. And so I just kept at it. At one point, he then gave me a liberty pass whereby I could leave the base at any time and return at any time. All I had to do was just let him know when I'd be coming back and so forth. So it was something. But when I lost my opportunity for a commission, then I realized Marine Corps was not going to be for me. So I chose to get out. Now today, since the ambassador is always in charge of things in any post in which he serves or she serves, it happens that in Barbados and Grenada, where I was in charge of things, I was a U.S. ambassador and chief of the U.S. mission to those countries. There were four military installations. Technically, they all reported to me through their commanding officers. So, but the embassy had nothing to do whatsoever with those four military installations. So I talked with the Secretary of Defense, who then made the senior military officer defense liaison to the ambassador. And from that point on, I had that person to be a member of what was called my country team. So I became sort of a hero or something like that with the Defense Department. For the first time, they were part of the official family of Americans in Barbados, Antigua, and two other islands and so forth. Oh, as far as Korea, I became part of a group called the International Peace Federation, and this led to my being up in Korea about 8 or 9 times in the last, maybe in the last 15 years or so.
Well, thank you very much, sir.
Make sure you take your mask down so we can hear you good.
I got it, sorry. Good afternoon, sir.
Yes,
I'm private
sir.
first class. Hi, sir. I'm private first class, Sisu Simba. I was gonna ask you about, I had 2 questions actually. The first question was, what did you study in school when you went to New York University, I believe? And how did you transition from being a Marine to be in politics? What was that like back in those days?
All righty. When I signed up in the Marine at NYU, having come through the High School of Commerce, I thought of accounting, but it didn't take long for me to realize that accounting was not for me. But then I thought back to my days of interest in diplomacy, and the closest I could find was international trade. So I began studying international trade, and this began to introduce me to different countries in terms of our trade relations. But I gravitated quickly from that into international banking and foreign exchange. And this was really up my alley. I remember my first trip to Mexico, and this was about 1950, whereby someone was making a conversion of my money, dollars to pesos. And right in the middle of it, I realized that this man who was doing the conversion probably had not gone to high school or anything. And here I am having him to convert my money for me. And it began to enlighten me that I needed to realize that I was now becoming an expert in foreign exchange. And so from that point on, I was converting my own money and making a profit in the process, by the way. But from from that point of becoming a banking and finance major meant that no matter where I went, I was invited invariably to be associated with money. Well, I don't know of anyone who dislikes money in this country. It's a competitive country, but I always seem to have lots of it, and I seem to know how to get more and more of it all the time. So I was happy to be involved in it. Now, there was another point to that question, and repeat it for me.
Yes, sir. My second question was, how did you transition from being a Marine to politics, being an ambassador? I believe you were in St. Lucia, Barbados, Antigua, Dominica Republic,
Yes.
all those countries. Like, what was that like?
Well, let's see. I came out of the Marine Corps. I left active duty, I should say, in 1951, and I went back into government in 1971. This was in research and technology. So by that time, I'd done some other things, especially in the field of banking and so forth. Now, even in the Marine Corps, there's always a lot to do with money, budgeting and so forth. I was telling my wife earlier about my experience with the dispersing officer, Colonel Bonds, who I was very friendly with because I had often things to do with, again, with money. And at one point I came into his office, I just tapped on the door, and he said, "Come in." I went in, I said, "I see you've changed your title, Colonel." So he said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "I thought you were the dispersing officer, DISBURSING, but the new sign out there shows you as the dispersing officer, DISPERSING. He got up out of his seat, he roared out, demanding to know who in hell had painted that over, just like that. So my relationship was always good, but no matter where you go or what kind of work you do, if it deals with money, you're always welcome. And by the same token, there was always something to deal with money. So I had no problem. Now, as I began to grow older, I should say, I would run into a goodly number of Marines. And quite often when they talked with me, they would immediately assume that I was an officer, but the answer was no. But I was very proud of my Marine Corps experience and some of the people whom I had met and whom I dealt with. Some of you young fellas have never heard the name Lewis Wilson, I guess. Lewis Wilson was the last commandant to hold the Medal of Honor. And recently, in my Montford Point Marine chapter, we had General Stevens, Major General Stevens, to be our speaker. General Stevens knew me because we had met before. He is president of the Medal of Honor Association. He received it in Vietnam. He had received the Medal of Honor, and I have the Congressional Gold Medal. So we were on the class. We were in a program together. And I'll by the way, I have it here, so I'll show it to you. It's. I don't know if you can see it very well.
Yes, sir. I can.
Okay, and it says, of course, for outstanding perseverance and courage that inspired social change in the Marine Corps. That's on the back of it here. Now, we received this in 2011, if I recall, from we received it after the Tuskegee Airmen. General Amos had been one of the people to really push hard to get us boys. He and I became very, very close friends. This is a picture of General Amos on the day I received my medal. That's my wife in the hat, my oldest daughter, and my youngest son standing with me. And I might say that General Amos, when he invited us up to have breakfast with him and his wife up there, and I'm talking about all of the living Montford Point Marines that he could find, he and I took this, and I presented him with a cap to make him an honorary Montford Point Marine. So he and I, as I say, became very close. And in fact, I have a paper here that at some point I'd like to read a little bit from it because it showed how my feelings about the Marine Corps had changed a lot. Yeah, but go ahead. Did you have another question?
No, sir, I don't think we have any more questions, sir.
Well, then I can read a little bit of this, my new Marine Corps relationship. Do you
Oh,
have time for it?
we do have one more. We have one more. He had one more. Go ahead.
I had one more, sir. So you joined in 1944, I believe,
Yes, sir. January of 44.
and you talked a little bit about how the race relationship between black and whites were up and down. What made you join back then in 1944 when knowing that, you know, the relationship between, you know, colors, the whites and the blacks were difficult?
Actually, I didn't. I was in seventh heaven in my high school. I was still in high school, being well treated. We had good relations with everybody. This is in New York City, by the way, and the idea of where the Marine Corps was, I knew that the training camp was in Paris Island, and I knew that there was a training camp in Camp Pendleton, but I didn't know anything at all about Montford Point. And so when I joined, actually I was given a choice of the Army or the Navy, and I said I want the Marine Corps. And the answer, well, the Marine Corps is filled, their quota is filled. And I said, well, I still want to go in the Marine Corps. And so the sergeant in charge, his name was Motier, I always remember that name, gunnery sergeant, said that I'll see what I can do. And he went away and came back later on and said, you're in. And so there were two of us who ended up going down to North Carolina together, a fellow by the name of Hansel Shaw from Brooklyn. But that was the first time that I knew that the Marine had a separate camp for us. Once I arrived there, of course, I guess having been born in the South and lived up north, I was accustomed to people. And by the same token, again, my study of words, people, reading, had taught me an awful lot about people. So I am not carried away with what I can expect sometimes of people, either one way or the other. But I fitted right in. And I used to think that no matter what the drill instructor did to us, he would have to suffer with us. I saw fellows who were much larger than myself faint when given a vaccine or a shot or something. And so I could take anything that came to me. And as I say, although after leaving, I was a little bit miffed not getting a commission, but that was one of the best things that happened to me. So many of my friends that I've talked with later who were in Korea found it to be one of the toughest wars they've ever been in. I've just done a review of a book called Echo of Our War by 10 Marines in Vietnam, but I found that they really had a much more difficult time. So forth. I can still read this, a little bit of this change of relationship, if you wish. Yeah.
Yeah, Tom.
You good?
Yes,
All
sir.
right.
Yes,
All right, sir. Yeah, any other questions? Okay, we got about 5 more minutes, sir. I got to get them back to their platoon, sergeant. So.
Okay, I assumed as much. Okay, let me say this. Over the past year or so, I've sort of renewed a long-standing relationship with the U.S. Marine Corps. I was young and innocent when we first met, and it just didn't occur to me that my partner was older, more experienced. And while both of us pledged Semper Fidelis, it never occurred to me that my partner was not always completely faithful. I'm talking about the Marine Corps. As the years passed, we drifted apart, although I never lost affection for the Corps. I just wanted change and faithfulness. On many occasions, I saw flashes of change which caught my attention, but not my resolve to resume what had been lost. Flame of my youth was gradually rekindled as I began to meet with the Montford Point Marine Association, and then with many of the outstanding Marines in the group. At one point, of course, I remembered one of our young officers. He was a captain teaching at the Naval Academy, was driving through Silver Spring, Maryland with his wife, little daughter, and his father-in-law. And his father-in-law was killed by a man who had some racial tendencies. He fired and killed him. Also, one bullet hit his wife, paralyzing her for life, leaving him with just his little daughter and himself. He knew that his life in the Marine Corps was ended because in the Corps, you've got to travel. And in this case, his wife would have had a difficult time to travel. But the commandant went down to the academy and talked to him. His name was Stanley. And he said, "Stanley, the Corps will look out for you." That Captain Stanley went on to become a major general and to end his career in the Marine Corps. He's now in divinity school. But that action on the part of the Marine Corps restored my faith in it. Okay, years later, when General Amos became commandant, he invited all of the Montford Pointers that he could find up to the Marine Corps for breakfast. This is 8th and I. When we arrived, there was the general standing there on the steps, welcoming each one of us. And about 4 or 5 steps in back of him was Mrs. Amos. I call her Bonnie. And all of them greeted us. Both of them greeted us, sometimes with a big hug. And this was the first time that I'd ever set foot in 8th and I. And this was continued right on up to the time, as I say, when I presented the cap to General Amos. And one of my friends, his name was Ed Pfizer, he's no longer dead. He's no longer around now. But he presented a pendant with the Montford Point emblem to Mrs. Amos. But my relationship with the Marine Corps was secure from that point on because we had been welcomed back with such open arms. And I'm always grateful to it. As the years have passed, because I am ambassador, it's equivalent to four stars. I get welcomed royally whenever I go to the Corps or to any of the special events. And so my reconciliation is complete. But then again, it's also made me so much more appreciative of all Marines. And as I see some of the things that are being done, I've had to lecture on Vietnam, lecture on World War II, lecture on Korea and what have you. And I see so many of the things, even when we had the Ebola outbreak in Africa, and I found that it was Marines who were going over there to help the people. I get so proud of all that you guys and gals have been doing. So I just want you to know my heart goes out to you and everything that you do. I wish you all the very best, all the success. Educate yourself, learn as much as you can, and always know that you're a leader. Now, I don't know if you can see it, but I make it my business wherever I go to wear my globe and anchor. And a lot of people recognize it. I don't see too many people wearing it, but I do wear mine, and I'm proud to wear it. So again, I want to wish you all the best and say, Semper Fi, hurrah, and God bless you.
Thank you, sir.
Same to you, sir. Same to you. Same to you. Everybody. Big hurrah for Senator Britton. Y'all do better than that. Let's go. 2, 1. Hoorah!
I have to give you this one. One of our.
There we go. Sir, appreciate you. I thank you for your time, sir, taking your time out to talk to them. I would like to think a lot of that knowledge you passed, some of those gifted words will stick with them. And I will make sure that you will get a copy of this recording before this week is out, sir.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, sir. Talk to you later.
Okay. Semper Fi.
Semper Fi, sir.